Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. That's a quote by Carl Gustav Jung regarding our shadow. I'm going to go over 4 ways that I've learned to identify my own shadow and share them with you. So one of the first ways that I've learned to identify my shadow in the very beginning of learning Jungian psychology was quite simply through introspection, trying to see how I behaved and thinking about all the ways that I may have acted in daily life. So a lot of self-reflection involved. And it's a lot more difficult to introspect about your shadow because in essence, it is behind you. If you take the ego as light and right behind the ego, there's your shadow. So it's in the unconscious. So it's really difficult to actually see your own shadow in yourself. So, which leads me to the second way, which I learned from Marie-Louise von Franz, who was an associate of Carl Jung, an analytical psychologist or Jungian psychologist. And she said, "Show me your friends and I'll show you your shadow." And when I heard that quote, it clicked with me, and I started analyzing my friends and seeing what type of qualities they have and their character. And it made a lot of sense because we usually are attracted to friends or people that have qualities in which we lack. So for example, if I'm an introvert, I'll befriend an extrovert, and vice versa. If they're an extrovert, they'll befriend an introvert. So that's where the term comes from, opposites attract. We usually unconsciously look for the qualities that we lack or that we admire, but we believe that we lack. So you end up becoming friends with them. And that's why in some friendships, there is this unconscious competitive drive between the friends. It's because those are the qualities we lack, and so we kind of strive to be more like them or have this desire to be more like them. And it goes both ways. The introvert admires the worldly success of the extrovert, and the extrovert admires the authenticity of the introvert. So there's this sort of push and pull dynamic when it comes to friends, and that's a really good way of identifying your shadow. And there's a misconception nowadays about the shadow, which is that our association with the term shadow is mostly negative. We think that the shadow are these qualities in which are to be disregarded or rejected, and in a societal sense, that might be the case where it is inappropriate to display our shadow qualities. And so ultimately what we end up doing is repressing our shadow, and that actually has a negative impact on our mental health and society as a whole. The point of analytical psychology is to individuate, and that begins by integrating the shadow, which is closer to the ego. And then you would want to integrate your anima animus, and then finally integrate with the self. It's coming to full knowledge of yourself, or in other words, to becoming whole. So look at your friends and you'll be able to see what qualities they have, and you can safely assert that you yourself possess some of those qualities. The next step that I learned to identify my shadow was through shadow projection, meaning before learning Jungian psychology, and for most people who are unconscious or unaware of their shadow, what we normally would do is to project our shadow. It's very common. And one way to notice when you're projecting your shadow is, let's say you're in a space where there's people, and let's say you're a guy, and a guy walks in, and you just have this almost instinctual dislike for that person, for whatever he does, for his mannerisms. Maybe he's obnoxious, maybe he's rude, maybe he's loud, and you just have this instinctual aversion to him. You don't know why, you just feel it. You don't like this person. That is shadow projection, meaning that I possess those qualities. So if I felt that he was obnoxious, loud, rude, and I don't even know the guy and he's a complete stranger to me, I'm projecting my shadow. It means that my unconscious has identified those qualities. Instead of within myself, I've externalized it and found it outside of myself, in my environment. So it's an unconscious recognition of those characteristics that I possess. And it's very painful to realize that, but at the same time, it's very liberating. because then you can just essentially fix it. So you just say, okay, I possess those qualities. How do I lessen those? And ultimately, when you do that, that's sort of the beginning of integration, is just recognizing the qualities first, being able to distinguish what qualities are yours. Stop. And then ultimately you stop projecting your shadow. And that creates less shadow projection in the world, which helps immensely with collective shadow projection, which has the capacity to, in the big picture sense, start wars. Is collective shadow projection, Nazi Germany and the Jewish people. It's of the utmost importance to recognize your shadow in yourself to prevent shadow projections, because shadow projections is really dangerous for humanity as a whole. Like I said before, we have this misconception about the shadow. It is not all negative. The shadow has just as much positive qualities as it does negative. For example, I'm an introvert and I'm a little laid back, maybe too laid back. So what I would normally do in situations is like avoid conflict, try to create harmony within the group. But if I've integrated my shadow and learned how to use it properly, and there's someone giving me a difficult time, I could bring my shadow out, which as an INTP, my shadow would be an ENTJ. I could allow my ENTJ out, who's assertive, who's dominant, who knows how to create boundaries, who is a bit loud and can be obnoxious. Allow my shadow to come out and put my foot down when I need to, instead of being laid back. So the shadow has immense capacity to help you in situations when it's called for, as long as you learn how to integrate it. What happens is, if you don't integrate your shadow and you are pressured by society or by family to repress your shadow, repressing it doesn't make your shadow go away. As a matter of fact, it makes it grow darker, denser, larger, and more powerful. And there's a quote by Sigmund Freud that says, the more perfect a person is on the outside, the more demons they have on the inside. So you should never repress anything, first and foremost. And if you continue to repress it, what ultimately could happen is that the shadow will inevitably come out and quite possibly have the potential to possess you. Think of like when you're sick and you have less willpower to control yourself. The shadow tends to come out during those times. So a person who is usually moderate in their behavior could become a little more exaggerated in their behavior. That's a small example. Another example is when someone's drunk. Their shadow usually comes out when they're drunk. So they could have this very even-keeled nature, but when they're drunk, they become this very dramatic person. And you can see that all the time at parties. So essentially, people let their shadow out on the weekends, probably unconsciously as a means to not repress their shadow, so to let it out. And we do have festivals and traditions where we collectively allow our shadow to come out during those times as a means of not repressing it. So the fourth and most important way that I have learned to understand my shadow is through dreams. And that has been the most effective and profound way of identifying and really visualizing what your shadow looks like, is through dreams. Through dreams, the shadow is personified as an actual person. So the way you identify the shadow in your dreams is, most of the time in dreams, the shadow will be the same gender as the dreamer. So if I'm a guy, my shadow will be a guy. If I'm a girl, the shadow will be a girl. When we dream about people, they're usually reflections of ourselves for the majority of dreams. In some cases, it's objective, meaning it's about the actual person in real life. But for the majority of us, our dreams are subjective, meaning it's an aspect of us. So if I dream about a guy, that means that I have some aspect of that person. It's just personified as that person. So let's say you dream about your friend, let's say your best friend. That means your unconscious uses him as a personification of those qualities that you possess. It's just a way of communicating to you, to your consciousness, that, hey, look, you possess these qualities that your friend has. It's not about your friend, it's about you, and it just borrowed the image of your friend. It's just an image. That's really helpful. So I actually have an ENTJ friend in real life, and the reason why we became friends was precisely because he was my shadow. Initially, I did not like the guy, and he did not like me either. We were just completely, quite literally opposites. Not just physically in appearance, but psychologically as well. We just completely opposites. Once we overcame that projection, we actually became best friends, almost brothers. So and ultimately I actually had dreams about him, which means that I possess those qualities. It's almost like the dream was almost like this confirmation, like, yes, you really do possess those qualities. So my unconscious borrowed his image to illustrate what my shadow looks like. So that's a really good way of learning how to identify what exactly your shadow looks like, because before that it was kind of this esoteric, obscure, fuzzy image of what my shadow looks like. Okay, like I know that my shadow is obnoxious, loud, arrogant, assertive, overly dominant, very not compassionate, all those things. But now, when through dreams, it shows me like a figure, a person. Like I mentioned before, the shadow is not all negative. So it can have positive qualities, which can come to your aid when the time is needed. So for example, my ENTJ friend is extremely good with people and communication and being assertive and knowing what he wants and knowing how to get what he wants, which are some of the qualities that I lack. So I can evoke, once I've integrated my shadow, those qualities and become those things. Although it does take a lot more energy, you have the capacity, once you've identified your shadow and you know what it looks like, you can evoke those qualities and use them in everyday life to aid you. And you start living life more fully because you're no longer living it only in the light. You're living it in the full spectrum of life, which is both light and shadow. And you're not repressing anything either. So it's psychologically quite healthy. So through dreams, it's a really good way to identify what your shadow looks like and how you can personify it as a means of giving the definition an image to work with. So like an actual person. Another good way to illustrate what the shadow looks like is if you've watched The Avengers and if you followed it throughout the series. In the very beginning, Bruce Banner, the Hulk is Bruce Banner's shadow. So in the very first Avengers, you can see that the Hulk was extremely primitive and brutish, and he was completely unconscious. Bruce Banner had zero control over the Hulk. Even letting him out, he had to become unconsciously angry to let the Hulk out. But then if you follow through the series, you start seeing the shadow develop as he became more integrated, as he learned to, in essence, control himself and his shadow and define his shadow a little more, to the very end in Infinity War, where him and his shadow ultimately integrated, and now he has the Hulk's body, but Bruce Banner's consciousness. So he has the shadow's strength, but Bruce Banner's intelligence. And that's what an integrated shadow looks like. Another literary example would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that's why it's so important to integrate your shadow. You can see how, although in Infinity War, the Hulk was not as useful as he should have been, but it shows you that the shadow is an integral part of who you are. And in order to become whole, you need to integrate your shadow. And the first step to integrating your shadow is by identifying it. In dreams, when individuals initially start the analysis, the shadow appears quite literally as a shadowy figure, most of the time chasing the dreamer. And the dreamer's oftentimes running from the shadow, trying to get away, hide from the shadow. That's really indicative of what is going on in our psychology. So the dreamer is essentially running away from those aspects of himself. He or she may be repressing those aspects, and quite literally in the dream, as a form of compensation to show the dreamer that they are doing this, is that they're trying to escape from those qualities that they possess. And like I said, and I've had clients where their shadow has become so large and so big, mainly because they've been running from it their whole lives, up until the point where we started analysis. It's really scary because at that point, my normal advice, if the shadow is not that big or not that large, is to just turn around and stop running and face the shadow. Most of the time, he or she just wants to return your wallet, so to speak. But at some point, when the repression is so great, the shadow has become so dense and so dark, in the dream, it is literally a demonic figure that could destroy the ego. In some cases, it is okay to run. Ultimately, what that means is to work on the shadow bit by bit, like chop it away little by little. That's what I would do in analytical psychology if I ever came across a client with that kind of shadow, is not to confront it all at once, otherwise it will destroy the ego. It's grown to such a large size, there's no way we could attack it head on. We would have to kind of strategically chop at it little by little. Those are the 4 ways that I've used to identify my shadow. You can use any one of those in any order, really. You could start today by just thinking about your friends and seeing like what qualities do they have, introspecting on your behavior, like how did I behave in a way that I didn't control myself, or shadow projection, does someone make you uncomfortable without you even knowing that person? That's usually a projection. And then dreams, just writing down your dreams and seeing what kind of characters appear in your dreams. And if it's the same gender as you, it's safe to assert that that is probably your shadow. And then write down like what qualities did that shadow figure have? Like, were you running away from it? And if in the dream it didn't seem like you had any reason to be scared, although you were scared, maybe you should just stop running, turn around, face your shadow. And you'll notice that when you decide to do that, the figure transforms into this friendly figure. It's no longer this demonic beast chasing you. It turns into this helpful guide or a friend, a long lost friend from your past. And a lot of the times that has been the case when I've done dream analysis for people, is once I've analyzed a dream correctly and I've told them that that's your shadow, those are qualities that you possess that you're running away from, stop running from those qualities, learn to love those aspects of yourself, learn to integrate those aspects of yourself, the shadow transforms into a friendly figure, usually a best friend or a partner in crime. So several ways to prevent yourself from repressing the shadow is to express yourself, express your shadow. You never want to repress anything. What that ultimately means is if you have a feeling, you should express it. And there are many ways you can express it. And this is why they say the shadow is responsible for our creativity. It's because we can actually express the shadow through creative work. Ways to express your shadow through creative work could be through art, could be through dancing, could be through martial arts, could be through some form of physical activity. There are just so many ways. As long as you're not repressing a certain feeling or a certain urge to do something, you're living a full life. You're no longer creating that unlived aspect of yourself and then repressing it. That's how you become more mature and developed, psychologically speaking, is by learning how to integrate all those aspects that reside within you. So I personally do mixed martial arts to let my shadow out, and the more you learn to integrate it, the more useful he or she becomes. So let's say in a situation where I need to be more assertive, I could easily allow my ENTJ shadow out and become more dominant when I need to, let's say in a meeting or amongst a group of friends who are arguing. I could easily put my foot down and say, like, essentially let my shadow out consciously. The goal is to be more conscious. That is the goal in life. And in psychology, it's to become more conscious. So thank you so much for watching. And if you want to know more about these subjects, I've developed an application on the App Store that pretty much go over all these topics that I've been talking about on my channel, including the shadow. And it also goes through cognitive functions in personality types, which is extremely useful for dealing with other people and learning how to communicate with other people, as well as identifying their shadows. And if you want to reach out directly, I developed a website where you can reach out to us at dreamanalytica.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.